The night had teeth, sharp, unrelenting, gnashing against the edges of the world. Rachel tightened her scarf against the biting wind as she hurried through the darkened streets of Black Hollow. The town was an enigma, a place where whispers traveled faster than the wind and secrets clung to every corner like cobwebs. She had only moved there 3 weeks ago, hoping for a fresh start. A new teaching job at Black Hollow High promised stability after the chaos of her divorce. But the town's strange silence had gnawed at her ever since she arrived. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the streets after sundown or the way the shadows seemed thicker, denser. It was the way people avoided certain topics, how they averted their gazes when she asked too many questions. It all started with the house. The old Victorian on the hill had been too good a deal to pass up. Rachel knew a red flag when she saw one, but the price was suspiciously low, even for a fixer-upper. The landlord, a wiry man with hollow cheeks and eyes like burnt coals, had barely spoken when she signed the lease. His only words of note were, "Don't go into the basement. Ever." Rachel had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was some old man's superstition or perhaps a structural issue he didn't want her poking at. But now, standing outside the house, the darkness seemed to press against her like a living thing. She fumbled with the keys, each scrape of metal against metal echoing too loudly in the still night. The door groaned as she pushed it open, and the familiar smell of old wood and mildew greeted her. Rachel dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her boots. The warmth of the house should have been comforting, but it felt wrong, thick and oppressive, like she was inhaling more than air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. A text from Hannah, her best friend. "Hannah, settling in okay? Don't let the small-town weirdos scare you. Call me later." Rachel smiled faintly and typed back a quick reply before tossing the phone onto the counter. She made her way to the living room, where the fireplace still bore the ashes of the last tenant's final night. She hadn't touched it since moving in, unsure if the chimney was clear, but tonight, the cold seemed to seep through the walls. She froze mid-step. A sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum, came from somewhere below. The basement. It was faint, like a whisper, just on the edge of hearing. Rachel's skin prickled as she strained to listen, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Just the pipes," she muttered to herself, forcing a laugh. She didn't believe it. Rachel moved through the motions of her evening routine, heating up soup, flipping through channels on the ancient TV she dragged in from her car. But her mind was tethered to that hum, the way it had seemed to vibrate in her bones. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was nothing, but by the time she crawled into bed, sleep was a distant hope. The next morning brought no relief. Rachel taught her classes with the enthusiasm of a robot, her thoughts clouded with unease. The hum hadn't returned, but its absence was almost worse. She caught herself staring at her students longer than necessary, wondering if they could feel it too, the quiet tension of a town holding its breath. "Miss Carter," a voice broke through her fog. Rachel blinked and looked down to see Emma, a shy girl who always lingered after class. "Sorry, Emma. What's up?" Emma glanced around nervously before whispering, "Do you live in the old house on Briar Hill?" Rachel frowned. "I do. Why?" Emma hesitated, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. "You should move. My grandma says bad things happen there." "Bad things?" Rachel kept her voice light, though her heart was pounding. "Like what?" Emma shook her head, her eyes wide. "Just, don't go in the basement." Rachel forced a smile and patted the girl's shoulder. "Thanks for the warning, Emma. I'll be fine." But she wasn't fine. The hum came back that night. It started just after midnight, a low vibration that seemed to pulse in the very foundation of the house. Rachel sat up in bed, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was organic, like the deep, resonant tone of a massive horn being blown miles away. She could feel it in her teeth, her skull, her chest. Gripping her phone, Rachel dialed the landlord's number. It rang twice before a garbled voice answered. "Hello." "It's Rachel," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's a sound coming from the basement. It's been happening at night." The man was silent for so long that Rachel thought the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke. "I told you not to go down there." "I didn't," Rachel snapped, her frustration overriding her fear. "But something's wrong." "What's down there?" "Just stay out of the basement," he said firmly, and the line went dead. Rachel stared at the phone, her pulse pounding in her ears. The hum grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just sound, it was pulling at her, tugging at something deep and primal. She had to know. The basement door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden slab with a rusted lock that no longer latched properly. Rachel stood before it, flashlight in hand, her breath hitching as she pressed her ear against the wood. The hum was deafening now, a symphony of discordant tones that seemed to shift and writhe. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. The air that rushed up to meet her was stale and cold, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, the flashlight beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The basement was unremarkable at first glance, a cement floor, shelves lined with dusty jars, and a pile of old tools in one corner. But as Rachel stepped further in, the hum intensified, seeming to emanate from the very walls. Then she saw it. In the center of the floor, a trapdoor lay partially ajar, its edges blackened as if scorched. The hum poured from the opening like smoke, thick and oppressive. Rachel's flashlight flickered, the beam growing dimmer as she approached. Her hand shook as she reached for the edge of the trapdoor, pulling it open. What she saw below defied explanation. The space beneath the trapdoor was pitch black, a void that seemed to devour the beam of Rachel's flashlight. It was as if light itself was unwilling to enter. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the darkness, her mind struggling to reconcile what her senses were telling her. The hum was louder now, pulsating like a living heartbeat, each note vibrating deep within her chest. She leaned closer, peering into the hole, and felt an inexplicable pull, as though the darkness were reaching out to her, inviting her in. Rachel stepped back, her hands trembling. "This is insane," she whispered to herself. Yet, her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Whatever was down there, it held answers. And she needed them. Grabbing the old ladder leaning against the basement wall, she positioned it over the opening. The rickety wood groaned under her weight as she climbed down, each step taking her deeper into the abyss. The air grew colder with every rung she descended. The metallic tang she'd smelled earlier intensified, mingling with the faint scent of decay. When Rachel reached the bottom, her feet met solid ground, smooth, like polished stone. She swung the flashlight around, but the light barely penetrated the suffocating darkness. Then, she saw them. Carvings. The walls were covered in intricate symbols, etched deep into the stone. They pulsed faintly, glowing with a sickly green light that seemed to flicker in time with the hum. The symbols were unlike anything Rachel had ever seen, alien and ancient, their meaning beyond her comprehension. Yet, they felt familiar, as if they were whispering secrets directly into her mind. Rachel took a cautious step forward, her shoes echoing softly against the stone floor. The room was circular, the walls curving inward toward a central pillar that rose from the ground like a jagged spike. Around the base of the pillar were objects, relics, perhaps. A tarnished goblet, a rusted blade, and what looked like a human skull, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, and Rachel dropped to her knees, clutching her head as a sharp pain stabbed through her temples. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against her like an invisible weight. And then she heard it. A voice. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, it resonated in her mind, a deep, guttural whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You should not have come." Rachel's heart pounded. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely audible over the hum. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. You seek answers, but the truth will consume you. Leave, while you still can. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to climb back up the ladder and slam the trapdoor shut. But her feet remained rooted to the spot. What is this place? She demanded, her voice trembling. Why is it under my house? The symbols on the walls flared brighter, and the hum crescendoed into a bone-rattling roar. The pillar in the center of the room began to shift, the jagged stone twisting and contorting as if alive. Rachel stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then, the pillar opened. It was a mouth, wide and gaping, lined with rows of jagged, obsidian teeth. From its depths came a sound that was neither growl nor scream, but something far worse, a noise that seemed to echo the deepest fears buried within her soul. Rachel scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the stone floor. The mouth exhaled, releasing a wave of air so cold it burned, carrying with it whispers in a language she couldn't understand but instinctively knew was not meant for human ears. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was this real? Or had she somehow fallen asleep and stumbled into a nightmare? She pinched her arm, hard enough to bruise, but the pain only confirmed her grim reality. The whispers grew louder, intertwining with the hum, creating a cacophony that filled the room. The mouth moved, its jagged teeth grinding together as it spoke. You are bound to this place now, as it is bound to you. Rachel's throat tightened. I didn't ask for this, she shouted, her voice cracking. I just moved here, I didn't know. Ignorance does not absolve you. The voice was merciless, each word reverberating through her very bones. The house chose you. The debt is yours to pay. Debt? Rachel's voice was a hoarse whisper. What debt? The mouth twisted into what could only be described as a grin, a grotesque mimicry of human expression. The debt of those before you. Those who called upon the void and failed to honor their bargain. Rachel's mind reeled. Was this why the landlord had been so insistent about the basement? Had he known about this thing? And if so, why had he left? Take it back, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I want nothing to do with this. The mouth let out a deep, rumbling laugh that sent cracked spiderwebbing across the stone floor. It is not that simple, child. You have seen us. You have heard our call. There is no escape now. The room began to shake violently, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the hum reached an unbearable pitch. Rachel covered her ears, her screams swallowed by the chaos around her. The symbols on the walls blazed with a blinding light, illuminating the room in sickly green hues. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the chaos ceased. Rachel opened her eyes to find herself back in her kitchen, sprawled on the cold tile floor. The basement door was shut, the house silent save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Her flashlight lay next to her, the beam weak but steady. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it all. But then she saw it, the blackened edges of her fingertips, as though scorched by fire. And in her mind, the hum lingered, faint but constant, a reminder that the darkness beneath her house was very real. Rachel staggered to her feet, her legs trembling. She needed answers, real answers. Grabbing her phone, she dialed the landlord again. The line rang once, twice, and then went straight to voicemail. Mr. Greaves, she said, her voice shaking. I don't know what's going on, but you need to call me back. Now. She hung up and turned to the basement door. Whatever she had unleashed wasn't going to stay hidden for long. And Rachel was determined to face it. Rachel barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the hum, its rhythmic pulse weaving through her thoughts like an unwelcome intruder. The images from the basement replayed in her mind, vivid and terrifying. The gaping mouth, the grotesque symbols, the cryptic voice that had spoken of debts and bargains, it all felt too real to dismiss. By morning, she knew she couldn't ignore it. The landlord, Mr. Greaves, hadn't returned her call, and the idea of confronting him in person seemed both dangerous and futile. But Rachel wasn't the type to cower in fear. She needed answers, and she wasn't leaving Black Hollow without them. Rachel spent the day in the local library, poring over dusty records and old newspapers. The librarian, a kind but timid woman named Mrs. Talbot, had been reluctant to help at first. But when Rachel mentioned the house on Briar Hill, Mrs. Talbot's demeanor changed. Her face paled, and she quickly retrieved a stack of brittle documents from the archives. "It's cursed," Mrs. Talbot whispered, her voice trembling. "That house has been a stain on this town for over a century." "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her heart racing. Mrs. Talbot glanced around nervously, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "It started with the Whittaker family. They built the house in 1892. People said Mr. Whittaker was dabbling in the occult. His business failed, his wife fell ill, and one by one, their children disappeared. They found his body in the basement, what was left of it, anyway." Rachel's stomach turned. "And after that?" "Every family that's lived there has faced tragedy," Mrs. Talbot continued. "Bankruptcy, disappearances, deaths. No one stays long. The longest was the Callahan family in the 1950s. They disappeared overnight. The police found the house abandoned, the basement door nailed shut from the inside." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "Why hasn't it been demolished?" Mrs. Talbot shook her head. "The town won't allow it. There are rumors, about the land. That it's not the house, but what's beneath it." Rachel clenched her fists. "What's beneath it?" The librarian hesitated before leaning in closer. "Some say it's a gateway. To another place. Another world." Rachel left the library with more questions than answers. As she drove back to the house, her mind raced with the stories she'd uncovered. If the house truly was a gateway, then what had she stumbled upon? And why had the landlord chosen her to live there? The house loomed in the distance as she approached, its silhouette stark against the gray afternoon sky. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. Rachel parked her car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. The basement was colder than ever. The trapdoor was still open, the ladder she'd left behind leaning into the void. The hum had returned, low and insistent, vibrating through the walls. Rachel descended slowly, her flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. This time, she was prepared for whatever she might find. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly as she stepped onto the stone floor. The central pillar loomed ahead, its jagged surface slick with condensation. The objects at its base were untouched, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the room were alive. "Show yourself," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If you want me, here I am." The hum rose sharply, and the pillar began to shift once more. Rachel gritted her teeth, gripping the crowbar tightly as the mouth reappeared. It twisted into that grotesque grin, and the voice boomed in her mind. "You return willingly." "Good." "I want answers," Rachel demanded. "Why me? Why this house?" The mouth's jagged teeth clacked together as it laughed. "You are the chosen vessel. The debt must be repaid. I don't owe you anything." Rachel shouted. "Not you, those before you." The voice grew deeper, more resonant. "The Whittakers called upon the void, but they failed to honor the pact. The Callahans, too, sought power and betrayed us. Their debt falls to you, the house's keeper. I didn't agree to any of this." Rachel's voice cracked. "I'm not paying for someone else's mistakes." The mouth opened wider, revealing a swirling darkness within, a void that seemed to stretch infinitely. The debt is eternal. It cannot be escaped. Rachel stepped back, her heart pounding. What do you want from me? Your soul. Your sacrifice will appease the void and close the gateway, for now. Rachel's grip on the crowbar tightened. There has to be another way. The voice paused, the hum shifting into a low, rhythmic chant. Perhaps, there is another. Rachel's chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. What? Bring another in your place. One who will take your burden. Only then will you be free. The weight of the offer crushed Rachel's resolve. Could she condemn someone else to this nightmare? Was her survival worth another person's life? The void pulsed expectantly, waiting for her answer. Rachel didn't remember climbing back up the ladder or closing the basement door behind her. Her body moved on autopilot, her mind consumed with the impossible choice she faced. She sank into the living room couch, staring blankly at the darkened windows. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Hannah. Hannah, hey, just checking in. Call me when you can. Miss you. Rachel stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Hannah was the only person who'd stayed by her side through the divorce, through every challenge. She was Rachel's anchor, her lifeline. And she was the only person Rachel could think of. The plan formed slowly, painfully. Rachel hated herself for even considering it, but the alternative was unthinkable. She couldn't give herself to the void. She had too much left to fight for. Too much to live for. By the time Hannah arrived that evening, Rachel had convinced herself it was the only way. Hannah's laughter filled the living room as she recounted a funny story from work. Rachel smiled weakly, her stomach churning with guilt. I'm so glad you're here, Rachel said, her voice strained. There's something I want to show you. What is it? Hannah asked, her curiosity piqued. Rachel hesitated, her heart pounding. It's in the basement. Rachel led Hannah down the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The basement felt even colder than before, the air thick with tension. Hannah followed closely, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced with cautious curiosity. Rachel, she said, her voice tentative, this place gives me the creeps. What's down here? You'll see, Rachel replied, her tone flat. Her grip tightened around the flashlight, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. She hated herself for what she was about to do, but the void's words echoed in her mind, one who will take your burden. When they reached the bottom, the glowing symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting the room in an eerie green light. Hannah stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the carvings and the jagged pillar at the center of the room. What the hell is this? She whispered. Rachel swallowed hard. I found this a few nights ago. There's something here. Something that demands a sacrifice. Hannah turned to her, confusion and fear etched across her face. A sacrifice? Rachel, what are you talking about? Is this some kind of joke? Before Rachel could answer, the hum returned, louder than ever. The pillar began to shift, its jagged surface twisting as the mouth reappeared. Hannah gasped, stumbling backward as the grotesque grin spread across the pillar. Another soul joins us, the voice boomed, echoing in their minds. Will she pay the debt? Hannah clutched Rachel's arm, her voice trembling. What is that? Rachel, what's going on? Rachel's throat tightened. It's the void. It wants someone to pay for the sins of the past. Choose, the voice commanded. Who will remain, and who will be free? Hannah stared at Rachel, her eyes filling with tears. You brought me here for this? To sacrifice me? I didn't have a choice. Rachel cried, her voice breaking. It was you or me. I didn't want this, Hannah, but I can't. I can't give myself to it. Hannah's face twisted with betrayal and disbelief. You were my friend. I trusted you. The void's laughter filled the room, a deep, guttural sound that made the walls tremble. The choice has been made. Prepare the vessel. The ground beneath them cracked, and dark tendrils slithered up from the floor, wrapping around Hannah's ankles. She screamed, clawing at Rachel's arm as the void began to pull her toward the pillar. Rachel, please, she sobbed. Don't let it take me. Rachel turned away, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible over Hannah's cries. But something inside Rachel snapped. No, she said, spinning back to face the void. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. No, this isn't right. The void paused, the tendrils hesitating midair. Defiance, the voice rumbled, its tone laced with amusement. You dare defy the void? Yes. Rachel shouted, stepping forward. This is your mess, not ours. You've been feeding on people for decades, but I'm not letting you take her. If you want a soul, take mine. Hannah froze, her tear-streaked face filled with shock. Rachel, no. It's the only way, Rachel said, her voice firm. I won't let you suffer because of me. The void's laughter returned, a sound that chilled Rachel to her core. A noble gesture. But sacrifice alone is not enough. You must embrace the void. Accept it willingly. Rachel squared her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. I accept. The tendrils released Hannah, who collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The void turned its attention to Rachel, the mouth widening as the darkness within began to swirl. Come, then. Fulfill the bargain. Rachel stepped forward, her heart pounding. She glanced back at Hannah, who reached out a trembling hand. Don't do this, Hannah whispered, her voice cracking. There has to be another way. Rachel shook her head. There isn't. Go, Hannah. Get out of here. Live your life. Hannah's sobs filled the room as Rachel stepped into the swirling void. The darkness engulfed her, the cold seeping into her bones as the hum grew deafening. Rachel opened her eyes to find herself in a place that defied comprehension. The void was endless, a landscape of shifting shadows and unearthly colors. The symbols from the basement floated in the air around her, their light casting strange patterns across her skin. You have entered the void, the voice said, its tone both triumphant and ominous. You are one with us now. Rachel felt the weight of the void pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. But instead of succumbing, she stood tall, her resolve burning brighter than ever. No, she said firmly. I may be here, but I'm not yours. The void seemed to recoil, the shadows writhing angrily. You are bound. There is no escape. Rachel clenched her fists, her mind racing. If I'm bound to this place, then I have power here. I won't be your victim. The symbols around her began to pulse in response, their light intensifying. Rachel reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the glowing shapes. It burned her skin, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she embraced it. The light spread across her body, weaving through her veins like fire. The hum shifted, its tone rising in panic as the void began to tremble. What are you doing? The voice roared, its anger shaking the void. I'm ending this, Rachel said, her voice steady. No more sacrifices. No more debts. The light exploded outward, tearing through the void like a wildfire. The darkness shrieked in agony, the symbols flaring brighter until the void began to collapse. Rachel awoke on the basement floor, her body trembling and her skin glowing faintly with the same green light as the symbols. The hum was gone. The air was still. Hannah knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. Rachel. You're alive. Rachel nodded weakly, a faint smile on her lips. It's over. The void is gone. Hannah helped her to her feet, and together, they climbed the stairs, leaving the basement behind. As they stepped into the light of the new day, Rachel felt a strange sense of peace. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The house was silent now, its secrets buried for good. But deep in the recesses of her mind, a faint hum lingered, a reminder that some things can never truly be destroyed.